Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here to talk about the best recordings of Shostakovich's Symphony Number 12, the one that very few people like, the one that everybody agrees is possibly his worst symphony. I don't think that's entirely fair, and I'll explain why as we go along. The piece actually has a lot of good music in it, but it was so freighted with biographical and programmatic significance that I don't think it's very easy to see the piece clearly. Let's first talk about the biographical significance. Shostakovich wrote it around 1960. He had been under tremendous pressure to join the Communist Party, which he did, much against his will, but he did it, and no one's quite sure why he did it. It was really considered something of a betrayal by the intelligentsia of the day because he had been a holdout for so long. And having survived Stalin and all of that stuff, no one could figure out why at that point he felt impelled to join the Communist Party. That was number one. Number two, and just as significantly, he had been under enormous pressure to compose an ode to Lenin, a gigantic choral apotheosis a la the Ninth. And he had said that he was going to do it. He had been promising it, but his own Ninth Symphony turned out to be a light comic opera buffa kind of thing. And the 10th was one of the greatest pieces he ever wrote, but he kept it in his drawer until after the death of Stalin. And the 11th was a programmatic piece, the year 1905, that tells a horrifying narrative of death and destruction, and does it so graphically that as a piece of socialist realism, it wasn't even acceptable because it was too much realism and not enough socialism. It's a very, very bleak and gripping piece. So for the 12th, that was supposed to be the one, and he couldn't do it. He just couldn't do it. It might be that joining the Communist Party was a way for him to sort of give the party something because he wasn't going to give them the symphony that they wanted. And so the 12th became a terrible, terrible problem for him. And even after the premiere, he was supposedly hysterical because he thought it was awful. And apparently, I mean, his friends say that he was contemplating suicide. I mean, he was a mess. He was just a mess. And quite often being a mess makes great music. And some of the 12th is great music, but some of it is not. And so it's only partially successful. But, you know, there's so many pieces out there that are only partially successful, and we don't care. We get around it. And you can get around it with the 12th. The second issue with the 12th, which is even more interesting, excuse me, than the biographical business, is the programmatic aspect. We had the year 1905 for number 11, and this is the year 1917. The revolutionary year. And the movements have titles. And the irony, we're going to get to the titles and talking about the whole symphony, but the irony about these titles is that whereas the 11th was absolutely a narrative, it was a film score, it told a story in music, and the titles told us what that story is, and the music fits them perfectly. In this symphony, the titles are kind of plastered on, and they can't possibly have anything to do with what the music is about. In fact, the music is purely as music, qua music. One of the most thematically integrated and tightly woven pieces that Shostakovich wrote. But there's a sense of fabrication to it, of, I wouldn't call it artifice, artificiality, maybe artifice is the word. You know, he's creating, it's almost like the Liszt sonata. Out of one basic motive that we hear at the very opening in the introduction, he builds virtually the entire symphony. And there are transformations and relationships between the movements. The whole thing is played as one continuous movement. It only lasts about 35 minutes. And it is remarkable purely as a musical structure. And that musical structure is so cogent and so tightly woven that the programmatic aspect is completely irrelevant. really totally irrelevant to it. He put those titles on because, of course, he felt obliged to, and the party was quite satisfied, with those titles because they traced the life of Lenin as he had promised, although without the choral apotheosis. And so we have to talk about the titles. And so that's also an issue. Now, in order to get through the symphony, it has some fascinating things in it. Let's start with the very beginning. The opening is a very romantic Russian tune. It sounds a bit like the opening of Borodin's Second Symphony or Tchaikovsky's Second Symphony. It's Shostakovich, at his most conservative. This is his most conservative symphony, harmonically at least. And it really harks back to the 19th century. That, of course, is what these party apparatchiks thought Russian music had to be, because time stopped at the 19th century. There's something very ironic about that when you think about it, because here they were pushing revolution, the socialist revolution, the communist revolution. Shostakovich's early work was written in that spirit during that wonderful modernist experimental phase when anything went, because there was a revolution and artists could get away with doing anything they wanted. But then, of course, it all backfired and went to hell. And the idea of revolution became a simple repetition of the standard, conventional, and traditional style of the 19th century, because that, of course, appealed to the masses, which was not into revolutionary artistic experiment. It's the great hypocrisy, the great lie at the heart of the entire socialist revolutionary enterprise, was that it was as regressive as you could possibly be, because that was the only way the people would have supported it. And it's really rather, it's another topic, the politics of it. But it explains why the 12th has the sound that it does. Here, listen to the opening. Listen to this opening too. Now, I don't play from the beginning. I play it from the part where the violins come in and repeat it, because the harmonization is so marvelously Russian. It's really, really unmistakably 19th century romantic Russian. Listen to this. See what I mean? That was Vasily Petrenko with the Royal Liverpool Philharmonic Orchestra on Naxos. This is one of the really good recordings of this symphony. And the fascinating thing about it is that the entire work is going to be based on that tune. And the tune breaks up into phrases which Shostakovich could use. There's da, 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 da. That's the first one. Da, 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 dum, ba, da. And that's the second one. And they're all going to be used. One of the more interesting things is this three-note motive he gets from that opening phrase. Da, 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 da. Take out the opening note and just go da, dum, bum. And you've got a three-note motive. And that is going to permeate the symphony, interrupting things and doing all kinds of strange interventions. Keep your ears open for it when you hear the symphony, because it divides phrases. It does all kinds of things, just this three-note, blong, 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 like that. And it derives straight out of that first idea. It's amazing. And the theme of the finale was da, 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 bum, bum, which is, of course, after the first phrase, da, 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 da. It's the same thing. You'll get it. It's so easy to hear. I don't even have to dwell on that. And there are other transformations that I want to talk about in a minute. So after that introduction, the first movement gets ripping. The title of the movement is Revolutionary Petrograd. And I don't know how revolutionary it sounds, but it sounds like a film score, like one of Shostakovich's battle film scores. There's a gorgeous, glorious apotheosis of a second subject, which is actually based on the same tune as the first subject, namely the introduction of the whole symphony, but one is in a minor key, one is in a major key, so you could juxtapose them neatly. And then an absolutely thrilling, thrilling development section. In fact, once the first movement gets going, it's one of the most exciting things that Shostakovich ever wrote. It's just good, exciting, pedal to the metal music. Is it great music? I don't know. I mean, it gets the job done. It does what it's supposed to do. It's physical. It has this incredible physicality. And that's what a good performance has to have. It just has to knock your socks off. And Petrenko does a very good job with it. Here, let me play you a bit of the development section. And my God, it's exciting. It really is powerful and exciting. Here, listen to this. Now, I said development section because the piece is in straight sonata form with a reverse recapitulation. That's how it works. Because everything's based on the same tune, it doesn't really make any difference what order in what order they occur or where they occur. So Shostakovich, who is very smart in matters of form, doesn't concern himself with being accurate textbook-wise, but it is a very obvious sonata form movement. Now, this runs very, 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 very smoothly with little percussion murmurs and things into the second movement. Now, the second movement is called, wait a minute, it's called Rozliv. Yes, Rozliv. Now, Rozliv was Lenin's hideaway before the revolution, from which he emerged to lead the triumphant overthrow of the Tsarist oppressor. And there's no way that you can get from this movement anything of the place or what was happening there. Nothing at all. I mean, at least the first movement had turmoil, right? It's a revolutionary Petrograd. It must have been quite tumultuous, and the music is. The second movement, not at all. The second movement is fascinating. It's the heart of the symphony, and I think I have my suspicions, and I talk about this in my book on Shostakovich, that what Shostakovich had in mind was basically writing a paraphrase, an instrumental paraphrase of Act 1, Scene 1 of Boris Godunov. Shostakovich, throughout this period, had been obsessed with Mussorgsky. You know, he rescored Boris Godunov, he rescored Khovanshchina just a year before writing this symphony, and then he was going to orchestrate the songs and dances of death. But more than that, if you look at Act 1, Scene 1 of Boris Godunov, that's the scene when Pimen, the monk, is writing the history of Russia, the very, very inflammatory history, the truth. He's writing the truth, and he's going to keep it hidden. And he's with the other monk, Grigory, who's going to be the pretender. He's going to become the Tsar after Boris Godunov is overthrown or dies. You know what happens. Anyway, the music is quite similar in both cases. I mean, although one, of course, has voices singing and one does not, but it has that lonely, wandering, nocturnal, somewhat desolate tune. Shostakovich incorporates one of the melodies from his 10 revolutionary choruses, 10 choruses to texts by revolutionary poets. And of course, the text is about, being miserable and browbeaten. and there are vocal elements throughout this movement. You get a sense of dialogue, of something happening. Most of it is a soliloquy. And then at the end of the scene, Grigory comes in and he loudly hurls out a curse on Boris Godunov. He says, "You may be powerful now, but somewhere in your realm, a monk is writing your story, and he is telling the truth, and you cannot hide from your fate or from God, the judgment of God." That's what he says. And in this movement too, there's a sort of a central section, which is a dialogue between the two. And then the original section comes back as a trombone solo, sort of like the trombone solo in Mahler's Third Symphony. I mean, this music is redolent of Mussorgsky and Mahler, because Act 1, Scene 1 of Boris Godunov was used by Mahler. We don't know if he knew Boris Godunov, but the same idea for the second movement of Das Lied von der Erde, the lonely man in autumn, that wandering idea with the woodwind melodies on top. It's very, very similar. And Shostakovich, of course, knew both, but this trombone solo is such an obvious sort of homage to that moment in Act 1, Scene 1 of Boris Godunov, where Grigory hurls his accusations at Boris Godunov, even down to the soft strokes on the tam-tam that symbolize the bell in the monastery ringing quietly. Here's that scene. I want you to just hear it. Think of the trombone as saying something. And what it says doesn't really matter. I think there's something in this movement where Shostakovich just got to the heart of himself. People say that the symphony was, sort of a throwaway, but no, there's real sincerity here, at least in this part. I think the sad part is that Shostakovich didn't feel capable of maintaining it throughout the whole work. But here is that moment when the trombone comes in and hurls its accusation, obviously not at Boris Godunov, possibly at the communist regime. I don't know. We always read things into these pieces by Shostakovich, and maybe it's a mistake too. But here I think there's really something to it. And lest you think, by the way, that doing a paraphrase of that sort is somehow unusual or Shostakovich is being uniquely Shostakovichian, that's not true. Composers do things like that all the time. They take big chunks of one thing and they somehow reimagine it in another. One of the most significant ones is Mahler, who was obsessed with the final scene from Verdi's Aida, and who basically creates an instrumental analog, just as Shostakovich might have done here, in the Adagio of his Fourth Symphony, going so far as to actually quote Aida at the appropriate moment. The music's different, except for the quotation, but the concept is similar, the structure, the framework. And here is one of those cases. And if you don't believe me, go listen to Act 1, Scene 1 of Boris Godunov, then listen to this movement and see what you think. So anyway, after the second movement, there is a 3-minute little connection to the finale thing. It's almost like the scherzo leading to the finale of Beethoven's Fifth, something like that. And it's called Aurora, Aurora being the battleship whose fusillade represented the assault on the Winter Palace in 1917. And that's what we get. We get a sense of foreboding, a sense of fear. We hear Shostakovich's, one of his many fear motives, that is a soft tam-tam stroke followed by a bass drum roll, which we'll hear again in the 13th Symphony. That's all here. And then, bits of the first movement, the motto theme of the symphony come popping in, and including the second subject. It all just comes racing in toward the end. And then the fusillade, the bombardment happens. And that bombardment is actually quite interesting because the theme of that bombardment is the theme of the central section of Razliv, of the second movement. And it's a new melody. It's not based on the opening motto, at least not so obviously. And the transformation is really quite remarkable. It's rather cool because it's so delicate and sensitive in the second movement, and it's such a ball buster in the third movement, which is actually a transitional passage to the finale. I have here a little sample of the original tune as you hear it in the middle of the second movement, followed by its gargantuan reincarnation when it becomes the incredible hulk of Shostakovich 12th Symphony themes. So here are the two of them with a little pause between them so you can hear a difference. It's very, very clever. Clever, yes, but meaningful? I'm not so sure. We want to find meaning in everything. One of the things about this symphony is that it works better if you don't try. It works better if you just note the fact that one theme is transformed into another theme and you don't worry about whether that's supposed to have some extra musical significance. I'm not sure that it does. It may have to Shostakovich, but we don't know what that is. So anyway, this runs into the finale. Now, the finale is the problem with this symphony. It really is. It's a very weak movement compared to the others and compared to others that Shostakovich wrote. It's a rondo. It's a straight rondo in classical form, A, B, A, C, A, with the B and C sections in a quicker tempo. The music is light, almost frivolous in tone. I mean, the rondo sections try to be heroic, but the middle sections are just playful. They're playful, they're delightful, they're light, they're easy. The problem with this movement is that it has no tension. And that's something that Shostakovich, even at his worst, always had. He was always full of tension. He was one of the most neurotic, intense people in, the universe. And this just doesn't have any. And I think that's really the big problem. And the other problem with it is that when it finally gets to the grand apotheosis, it's not, as you might have thought, an apotheosis of the introduction, the opening theme, or of that glorious major key second subject from the first movement. It's an apotheosis of the horn motive that opens the finale, which is not musical at all. I mean, it has no music in it. It's ya da 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 da. I mean, it's a nothing. It's really a nothing theme. And so the bigger and louder and more inflated it gets, the less convincing it sounds. Now, again, Shostakovich must have been aware of this. He must have been. But unlike the hollow, false triumph ending, for example, the Fifth Symphony, if that's how you accept it, you don't have to, but if that's how we accept it, the wonderful thing about the ending of the Fifth is that it works either way. It has that ambiguity. You can take it as hollow or you can take it perfectly seriously. This symphony, it just doesn't come off. I mean, it just doesn't. And because it doesn't, you're wondering, I don't know, music, it's not convincing. It's not sincere sounding. I think that's really the issue. But we know it's not sincere. That's the point, because Shostakovich calls the finale, get this, the dawn of humanity. Really? Now, does anybody think for 1 second that Shostakovich believed that this lovely little rondo in ABACA form, represents the dawn of humanity with charming, light, playful music and alternating with heroic explosions? I mean, what does that have to do with the dawn of humanity? It's absurd. Of course, the Communist Party people loved that part. They loved it for the title because that meant they didn't have to listen to it. But if you really listen to it, which I always suggest you do, you realize right away that there's no way in a billion, trillion, zillion years that this music represents the dawn of anything. And so, like I said, it's insincere music. It's deliberately insincere. And music has a hard time being insincere and still being good music. You know what I'm talking about? You can write music that is ironic, that is bitter, that is hollow in all kinds of ways, but it has to mean what it does and what it sounds like, or you're just not going to be convinced. And that, I think, is the problem with this finale. I really do. Now, there are any number of triumphant romantic style finales that are just as unconvincing as this one. Again, it's not a unique problem with Shostakovich. Of course, they're not called the dawn of humanity. But that's really the issue with the 12th. But up until that point, I really believe there's a lot of really fine music here. I really do. And so I can forgive the finale. And I will also say that within the context of Shostakovich's symphonic work as a whole, one of the most fascinating things about Shostakovich is that he never repeated himself. He never repeated the form of a large work. And this symphony has a totally unique form, just like all the others do. It's sonata form, first movement, the rondo finale, the short truncated third movement, the fact that they're all played run onto each other, attacca, one after the other. I mean, this is a unique child in the context of Shostakovich's symphonic family. So seen in context, it also has a place. I really think it does. So now let's talk about recordings a bit, and we can. This is easy. I only have 5 of them, and the reason I only have 5 isn't because there are only 5 good ones. It's because most of them are good ones. I mean, the 12th is not a symphony that gets separate performances outside of people who really know their Shostakovich or are really doing complete cycles. So if you have a complete cycle, you're probably not going to get a bad 12th. That doesn't mean you're going to get an exceptional one, but you're not going to get a bad one, because nobody who does it does a bad one. It sort of plays itself. There was a singleton performance. You may recall it came out on Philips with the Leipzig Gewandhaus Orchestra. I forget the name of the conductor. It was something like Lotka Gravis or something like that. And he did it. And that was, like, for many, many years, one of the few recordings of it that you could get your hands on, because there weren't that many complete cycles that were available, at least in the West. But now there's like a whole bunch of them, and they're all fine. So let me just tell you about the ones that I think are really good. First, this Petrenko recording on Naxos, which is excellent. Second, and this is essential, Mravinsky in Leningrad. This is from 1961, I believe, and it is alleged, October 1961, alleged to have been the premiere performance at which Shostakovich was present. I don't know. I don't go into those things, but I will say it is an amazing performance, incredibly intense and well recorded. This is on Urania, but it's been reissued a million other times. It's on Profil. It's all over the place. You can find it. Scribedum, I think, has it too. You can find it without too much difficulty, and it is an amazingly exciting performance. It's the fastest of all of them, and really just stunning. Stunning in execution, stunning in volume, and I believe it's mono. Well, it says it's stereo here, but you never know with these late 50s and early 60s Melodia recordings. Maybe it is stereo. It really doesn't matter. It's going to sound the same anyway, basically, but it sounds pretty good, and it's an essential document of the work's performance history. After that, this one surprised me. Barshai. Barshai, I always say, is a gentleman. Some of his performances are unbelievably thrilling, and all of them are incredibly musical, but they're not as vicious as some other performances. And the 12th is one of those symphonies that really, you cannot minimize the viciousness. It's not a piece that calls for much subtlety. You have to just go for it. And he does. He does. It's very exciting, very well recorded, and it's an excellent, excellent performance. Also excellent and very interesting interpretively is Nimi Yarvi with the Gothenburg Symphony Orchestra. Now, one of you left a comment saying that you liked the 12th and you liked this performance because it's so fast. It's not. I hate to tell you. It is quick in the finale, which is cannot be quick enough in the finale, but it actually has, I think, the slowest of all the slow movements on disc. It's a very, very smart interpretation by Yarvi because he plays the quick music for all it's worth, but he lets that slow movement be the true heart of the symphony. And for that reason, I think this is a really, really fine interpretation. Really amazingly good. So, yes, Yarvi on Deutsche Grammophon, if you can still find it. You're not going to want to get this whole box. This is a piecemeal box of all the symphonies by Bernstein, Chung, Yarvi, Karajan, Previn, Rostropovich. And, some of it's great and some of it's less great. And it really is good to just get the Yarvi 12th if you're interested in the 12th. However, I've talked about this performance a lot. I think it is hands down the best version of the 12th out there for reasons which I will tell you in a moment. It is Haitink with the Concertgebouw. This is an exceptional performance. Why is it exceptional? Because Haitink plays it as music. Because he understands that although the symphony might have these stupid titles for each movement, it is following a purely abstract musical process. And he spends all of his time and effort with the magnificent Concertgebouw, wonderfully recorded, elucidating and illuminating that musical process. You hear all the thematic interrelationships. The orchestra plays like demons. There is nothing underplayed about this performance. In fact, I think the finale comes off the best as in any performance. It's almost convincing because you hear the thematic relationships, you hear where the music's going. It has such direction. In Haitink's hands, it is all just shaped like what it is, an abstract work of musical art. And by putting the emphasis on the structural, formal, musical coherence of the piece, he delivers a performance which is exceptional in every way. Absolutely exceptional. So, good for you, the late, great Bernard Haitink. And that, my friends, is my take on the Shostakovich 12th. I hope this gives you a little incentive to go and give it a try if you haven't liked it, and to put aside all the programmatic and biographical nonsense and listen to it as pure music and see how it strikes you. Either way, keep on listening, folks. Thanks for joining me. Take care. Oh, wait, don't forget, our merch store is open. There's a link to it down below. buy things. You know you need them. Anyway, take care.